Howdy yo, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking through my collection of store forts that were found all throughout the world, but towards the second half of this video I've actually begun a comprehensive list of all of the store forts that I have been able to identify that once existed or still exist in the United States of America. Many may think that this is a European design, and the history of the store fort does lend itself back to much of the current narrative Renaissance period. But when we dive further into it, we will actually come to find that in this current narrative, we're told that store forts were no longer being built or being used in the late early 1800s is really when they were discontinued, so to speak, in Europe. And yet, when we come to America, the fledgling country of the United States, we find that after really the War of Independence and through the War of 1812 and through the Civil War and even into World War I, we have these store fortifications still being founded, still being built all across the United States. So for now, we're looking at the assortment of store forts that I found all across the world. These are such unique structures that would take such meticulous planning. The architecture alone, what they would have to do to transform the landscape. One can only imagine how these store forts were truly constructed. And we're led to believe that in these small groups of engineers, of troops, they had the ability to coordinate these massive events of building these store fortifications. So we will look at the store forts that were rising in the United States in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And again, this video is just food for thought, so take everything you see with a grain of salt. Before beginning this list, for each fort, I will give you a brief summary of the current narrative history, as well as providing you with any pre-1900 photographs I could find, and modern images where applicable, to give you a better understanding of the fortification in question. To better establish the basis for this ingenuity, we will first define a store fort. Right off the bat, something often skipped over in discussions of the store forts is that they were actually first employed, some say invented, in Italy by none other than Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and Renaissance man Michelangelo. Yes, that Michelangelo is credited with creating the store fort. We're told the necessity for the store fort arose with the development and further usage of cannons in the European medieval period. Ring-shaped fortifications built on raised land, usually tells or mounds, had been the commonplace for hundreds of years prior to the development of cannon usage in European warfare. Ring-shaped fortifications were easily penetrated and had many weak or difficult to guard locations. In contrast, the Bastion Fortress, or the Star Fort, was a very flat structure composed of many triangular bastions, specifically designed to cover one another and to cover a ditch made to take the brunt of larger impacts. To counteract the cannonballs, the defensive walls of the Star Fort were made lower and thicker. To counteract the fact that lower walls were easy to climb, the ditches surrounding the layers of walls were widened so that attacking troops were still exposed. They were built of many different materials, but the star forts that have lasted until today were usually built of earth and brick, as we're told brick did not shatter on impact like stone. Bastion fortifications were further developed in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries as a result of the French invasion of the Italian peninsula. The first known star fort existed in Florence, Italy, constructed by the aforementioned Michelangelo. The design then spread out of Italy in the 1530s and 1540s and was well known throughout Europe by the end of that century. Italian engineers were heavily in demand throughout Europe, leading to the founding and flourishing of many guilds that were related directly to star forts. The star-shaped fortification had a formative influence on the patterning of the Renaissance ideal city, and most major city projects at the time employed a star fortification as the principal center concept. Remarkably, we're told star forts, for all of their glory, fell out of usage by the beginning of the 19th century. And I quote, "In the 19th century, with the development of more powerful artillery and explosive shells, star forts were replaced by simpler but more robust square fortresses." End quote. With all that being said, let us now take a deep dive into the known star forts which existed or still exist in the United States of America, beginning with Fort Wayne in modern Detroit, Michigan. Fort Wayne is the third fort built on the area of Detroit, Michigan, and was constructed in 1848. The fort sits along the Detroit River and is constructed of limestone and brick. Fort Wayne sits on 96 acres of land, which was known to once house over 19 indigenous American burial mounds, or mounds of the mound builders. Fort Wayne was constructed atop the largest of these mounds. The last remaining of the 19 burial mounds was excavated and lost in the early 20th century. The first engagement of the War of 1812 was said to have occurred on the Sandhill Mound, which became Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne still exists today. The second fort I'd like to look at is, and excuse my pronunciation, the Fort de Chartres in Randolph County, Illinois. The history here is absolutely wild. On January 1st, 1718, a trade monopoly was granted to John Law by the French monarchy to establish the Company of the West. The goal of the Company of the West was to make a fortune off of the New World, mainly in precious metals. The administration of the entire Illinois country, then French-owned, transferred from Quebec to New Orleans, and in such, the governance of the country was given to this Company of the West. From their new star fort, the Company of the West ran the Illinois country. Their series of wooden, palisaded forts was made permanent with the star fort you see now, which was built in 1753-1754. Or so you think. We're told the star fort originally encompassed 4 acres within its walls. The walls were 15 feet high and at least 3 feet thick. The stone was said to have been quarried over 3 miles away and hauled by boat to the site. Yet somehow, this administrative center for the French fell into disrepair under the British and was abandoned by the year 1772. For centuries following, the stones from the original Star Fort's walls were then taken and repurposed into nearby buildings until nothing was left of the Star Fort but the masonry powder magazine. This small, original masonry building still stands today and is considered the oldest building in all of Illinois. The Star Fort was then rebuilt by the state of Illinois for museum purposes in the early 1900s and still stands today. Next, we will look at Fort St. Anthony, also known as Fort Snelling, in unorganized territory of Minnesota. This ideal Star Fort overlooks the bluffs of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. The location on which this fort was built was known as the Meeting of the Waters to the Dakota people and served as a place of significant spiritual importance. In 1805, Zebulon Pike signed an unauthorized treaty granting himself and the United States the land taken from the Dakota, with no formal witnesses. Eventually, the United States would use this treaty as the auspices for construction of the Star Fort Snelling. The fort was constructed in the year 1818 and was home to many influential people who would eventually gain their freedom from slavery, including Harriet Robinson Scott and Dred Scott. The Star Fort Snelling simultaneously served in both the Civil War and was the main base of operations for the United States government in the Dakota War of 1862. The Star Fort again housed troops in both world wars before being decommissioned in 1946. Fort Snelling then fell into disrepair, was renovated in 1965, reopened to the public, and is now run by the Minnesota Historical Society. It still stands today. One of the most amazing aspects of looking at this particular Star Fort was the ability I had to find the stereoscopic or old world 3D photographs. And you can see that the Star Fort situated here on the bluffs is absolutely some of the most incredible architecture I have seen from this time period. But let me know what you think down below. For the next few forts, we're going to be traveling into the state of Maryland. We will begin with Fort Marshall. This short-lived fort, which I could not find any photographs of, was said to have been built at the onset of the Civil War in 1861 to defend Baltimore from coastal attacks. What makes this even more interesting, we're told Lieutenant Colonel Henry Brewerton was charged with strengthening Baltimore's defenses. Not only did he construct Fort Marshall, but he also constructed at least two more brand new Star Forts named Fort Federal Hill and Fort Worthington, both of which I could also find no photographs of. We're told Fort Marshall was constructed atop a geological feature known as Snake Hill, which by many accounts was a burial mound or another type of earlier earthwork. We're told in the narrative that Fort Marshall was both Baltimore's most important fort during the Civil War, but was also never involved in any battles. And by the year 1864, still during the Civil War, this fort was considered to be a Union hospital. By May of 1866, the entire Star Fort Marshal was closed down, stripped, and what remained of the Star Fort was quite literally sold at auction. We're told much of the materials were then purchased by the newly founded Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. If that name doesn't speak volumes about what was happening in America, I'm not sure what will. A Star Fort built on top of an indigenous earthwork, never used in battle, then torn apart, and everything found inside the fort is sold to the highest bidder, who just so happens to be a government agency in charge of monitoring abandoned lands. The next fort we're going to look at is actually currently a state park in Big Pool, Maryland, but the park is based around the earlier Star Fort known as Fort Frederick. Star Fort Frederick was built in 1756 through 1757 by the colony of Maryland. Incredibly, we're told this fort was not built for defense, but rather was built as an intricate refugee camp for settlers looking to head into indigenous territories. The fort was not designed to resist artillery, as it was correctly assumed that the French would not be able to transport artillery to this remote location. However, unexplainably, the not defensive structure was still founded as a Star Fort. The fort housed troops during Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, but was never attacked. It never saw battle. Fort Frederick housed over 1,000 prisoners during the American War for Independence, seemingly indicating just how vast and expansive Fort Frederick truly was. The fort that exists today is a massive stone rectangle with large bastions at each corner. Each curtain wall is roughly 180 feet long and over 17 feet tall, with walls at least 3 feet thick, while the bastions, each projecting 100 feet, have walls that are at least 4.5 feet thick. Again, we're told Fort Frederick, this mysterious, massive Star Fort, was sold at auction in 1791, stripped of all materials, and sat empty until the Civil War. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was built parallel to this Star Fort. In 1861, the 1st Maryland Infantry occupied Fort Frederick, defending it on Christmas Day of that same year. By 1862, Fort Frederick was again abandoned. The fort, like many other Star Forts, had its stones reused in other nearby buildings. In 1922, the dilapidated Fort Frederick was purchased by the state of Maryland and transformed into Maryland's first state park. The Star Fort was rebuilt again at this time and still stands today. Next, we will go back to the coastal defenses of the massive city of Baltimore, looking at the most famous Star Fort, many would say, in America, Fort McHenry. This is one of the most well-known Star Forts in all of the world, both because of its visual splendor and also for the role that it served in the War of 1812. We're told Fort McHenry was constructed in 1798 by Frenchman Jean Foncin near Locust Point and was occupied continuously by American forces through World War II, serving the armed forces of America for well over 100 years, even after being designated as a national park in 1925 and as a national monument in 1939. Fort McHenry was the location where the national anthem of America took shape, as during the War of 1812, an American storm flag flew over the Great Star Fort. The flag was eventually replaced in victory on September 14, 1814, with an American garrison flag, and this event, signaling American victory in the Battle of Baltimore, was witnessed by Francis Scott Key, who put what he saw into the words that would become the national anthem, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Interestingly, Fort McHenry served as a military prison during the Civil War, and one of the inmates housed was the grandson of Francis Scott Key, Francis Key Howard. The Star Fort McHenry also still stands in much of its original glory today. However, many don't realize that Fort McHenry was quite literally built out of the ashes and on the foundation of Fort Whetstone, which was built in 1776. I believe I will wrap up this video there. This will be just part one in a long series of videos. Throughout this series, we will establish every Star Fort that existed in the United States of America, looking to find the oldest photographs of them, find any information about them, and to expose the history for what it really is. Please stay tuned with the channel and look for part 2 in this series. I thank you so much for being here.